Good morning. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
All right.
So welcome everyone to our third niche conversation of season 2. I'm Jessica DeWitt. I'm one of the editors here at the network in Canadian History and Environment. And today I am joined by Kara Murphy Schlichting. Oh, that did not tumble out very well. Anyways. Kara, do you want to tell us more about yourself?
Yes, thank you so much for having this conversation with me today, Jessica. I'm an urban and environmental historian. I'm located in New York City, and I'm a member of the history department at Queens College, which is one of the public City University of New York campuses out in Flushing.
Awesome. So this past summer, we had you write a piece for us, which was called The Swelter of Summer, Heat Waves in the Urban Heat Island in New York City. So that's why I've invited you here today to talk a little bit about this, kind of elaborate more on some of the details of this research. And I thought that we would start off by talking about what sources you use to trace heat wave history and perhaps some of the challenges associated with those sources.
Great. I'd love to, because it's been a real learning curve for me. My first book is a urban and city planning history that is really rooted in city planning documents, all those voluminous late 19th, early 20th century government reports and planners reports by people who were very self-aware of what they were doing was important and needed to be recorded, from letters to published records. And I came to the question of urban heat as a type of environmental challenge and often environmental inequality through those planners' records and the creation of the proposal for a Long Island State Park system, which is the kind of eastern hinterland of New York City. And I wanted to know more about not just how planners or government officials understood this, but through the everyday experience of urban heat, because that's how I interact with my urban environment. I live in Brooklyn and I see parks, right? And there's the water system and when it rains, but really it's like the temperature is my kind of most intimate interaction with environment in the city. And so I wanted to find other people who must have felt this way in the past. And I've had a real humbling as a new social historian and a new cultural historian to try to look for heat, because opposed to, if you think about all the other kind of seasonal types of weather that shape everyday lives in any place, city, suburb, or agricultural community, snow is really obvious and has a more tangible quality, as does rain and flooding. But heat is the least tangible and often invisible of these seasonal challenges. And so I wanted to figure out what it was like for everyday people, how they talked about it, the language they used. And I wanted to get beyond just meteorological records. Starting in the mid-19th century, the park commissioners at Central Park, which opens in the 1850s in the center of Manhattan Island, start to keep really detailed weather records. In fact, the details are so much that it's almost overwhelming as a historian. It's, every 6 hours, where the wind is coming from, what the air feels like, what the temperature is, what the precipitation is. And as a historian, I wanted to kind of get a more human side to those statistics. And so I have been looking in a couple of different places for heat. One is in public health records. So the Board of Health is created just about the same time as Central Park's park commissioners the following decade. And the way that they write about health and housing was a window into heat, because heat is often something that is really prevalent in the concerns about how disease spreads in the summer and the kind of the air quality inside homes, particularly tenements and overcrowded tenements. So I started to look in public health records and housing reformers records. And then the other two places, one is very typical, municipal minutes. So when and how does the municipal government start to recognize heat? The answer is infrequently and reactively as opposed to proactively. And then the last and the most fun is thinking about social history and cultural history. And so I've been looking in oral histories at the tenement museums archives, for example, to see just reading for moments where people note heat or humidity or being outside. And I've been looking in visual culture, because I have found that heat actually shows up all the time in visual culture, particularly photographs and turn of the century art and illustrations. And so it's a slide away from that top-down approach of governmental records, which are key, but it's taking me to the questions I really have about this kind of intimate bodily experience.
I love that. I love your discussion of how you experience the city through heat. And it's making me, because I moved to Saskatoon, Saskatchewan 10 years ago. So I'm originally from Pennsylvania. And of course, like winters here are brutal. You can get to negative 60 degrees Fahrenheit. But summers are also at the extreme. So like it was in the 90s this summer. And it's like the in between that we rarely get. It's like the extremes of weather. So I'm thinking, yeah, my bodily experience and how much that is, it really yeah, colors my experience of the city. And if we're thinking back in time, yeah, it's a way of like empathizing with people, I think, which kind of gets to the sensory history part of things, right? So in your piece, you talk about some of the ways that kind of the average New York City resident was experiencing this heat and how that differed from scientific notions of the heat. And I was wondering if you could talk about sensory history a little bit and how it informs environmental history or enriches it.
I'm just learning, and I will speak to what I have learned so far. And what I like about sensory history is that it is really it's universal, that people have understood the climates they live in through their bodily interactions with it. And that could be everything from what they put on their body or take off their body, the things they carry with them through the day, like you're more likely to bring your big water bottle in 2021 in July than you are in December. These questions of how you move through public space and how you use public space is really about how your body feels in that space. So I agree. I find them that past and present, we can start to ask these questions. But it doesn't mean, though, that there's a universalization of what it means to feel heat, right? It's a very much rooted in a particular place and time and the experiences of those people. Because in some ways, in our 21st century, when we interact with air conditioning, we can get to an extreme of cold and hot that didn't exist. In the winter, anyone who lives in a climate that has a severe cold, it was a long time ago that we figured out how to warm up buildings during the winter. And that's the difference that we saw in winter between bodily experience indoors and outdoors. That doesn't come until the mid 20th century for heat. So the amelioration of heat takes a much longer time through air conditioning and climate control. And so we have to try to understand the bodily senses of people who never cooled off in summer, who spent months without having that kind of relief that we get from walking into a Walgreens or a government building, right? This intense air conditioning. And so I'm trying to learn more about how sensory history can help us take seriously the senses that bridge us to the past, but that remind us that this is really built in particular bodies in particular places, and the kind of, the acclimation people have to the environments they live in. And so I think that sensory history can offer a lot to urban environmental history, and it's been increasingly prevalent in environmental history in the last 2 decades, right? Particularly Peter Coates looked at how sound and environment can help us ask new questions. And then David Barnes and Melanie Keachel have thought about smells and air. These are, so we think about your senses, what you hear, what you smell, and that they can help us understand that people use their senses to make sense of the cities they live in. They make sense of industrial growth. In Melanie Keachel's work about New York City, which has been really useful for me to start to think about senses, to think about like what was safe and what might be unhealthy, and how to understand public health in a time before germ theory. And I think for the bodily senses that I'm thinking about, that the kind of temporal comfort of summer heat, or discomfort, one should say, and thermal comfort are all questions that we can get through sense of how a body interacts with heat. And extreme heat is the place that it's easiest to find, because extreme heat has like physiological effects on the body. And we can start to look for those. Look, I've been reading like OSHA, which is kind of occupational safety literature about when a body is safe in heat and when it becomes, heat becomes a threat. And so thinking about the way that heat interacts through public health and through the body has been a way to bring thermal comfort and that kind of, that literal tactile sticky quality of being in a city that is as humid as New York. Because not only is New York warm, it's 60, it gets like high 70s, low 80s in its summertime highs. In Fahrenheit, it's also very humid, and humidity, that wet bulb temperature, it refracts and magnifies the feel of heat. And so that's that kind of question I've been trying to think about how we can think about unseen environment through the way it shapes physical feelings.
Mm-hmm. Oh, there's so much in there. Thinking about like all these parts that I hadn't thought of before, or you're approaching them in different ways. And that last thing is making me think about how here everyone's like, oh, it's a dry cold or it's a dry heat, so it's not as bad. And in some ways that's true. Like a -20 dry cold is not as bad as 25 degrees in a snowstorm in Pennsylvania, right? It doesn't feel quite the same. It doesn't leach into your bones as much. So if we're thinking of heat as well, and this idea of people who never cool down, and I think that's a really powerful statement that I was really like thinking about, and just like in our current day, like there's such inequality between people who do not have air conditioning and who do. I even experienced that myself as someone who doesn't have air conditioning, but that's just such a milder example, right? Of this like idea of like not having the ability to cool down.
And I think it's why reformers are so interested in it. I think it's why painters are so interested in it, and why news photographers, because it's omnipresent and it's expected. And so rather than thinking about, oh, we're talking about the weather as the most mundane thing you could talk about, in this moment, the rise of professional weather forecasting is happening at this same moment. The rise of progressive governments that keep volumes of records are rising. They're even changing the way that like death records are kept in New York City, and starting to make those kind of more specific in that good government progressive reform era. So we are interested in this in our daily lives. And in this moment in the late 19th century that I've been writing in, you can see that government officials and scientists are also really interested in trying to understand how things like humidity shape the experience of heat in New York, and how the weather moves across New York and the microclimate of the city. And they know very early on, they know by the mid-19th century, so the 1860s, they know that the city has a microclimate that is anthropogenic. Of course, they wouldn't use these words then, but they know they have created an urban heat island, what we call today. And so they're in real time trying to grapple with what it means to have human influence on their climate, and to understand how that affects the body. And so there's lots of focus from medical professionals and boards of health and government officials who are trying to, they're not all necessarily having the same conversation together, but they are trying to understand these questions that we understand to be part of like mundane life today when it comes to weather.
Fascinating. Yeah, so that kind of segues into our last question for you, which has to relate to like, so you ended up writing this piece because there are some people that contacted NiCHE looking for heat wave history, and we realized we didn't really have anything on our site about it. So the piece was kind of filling like a void, and I would love to have more people write about heat waves for us. So that kind of connects to the fact that I feel like our heat waves were definitely in our conscience, like our collective conscience this past summer. So what does this specific event or episode in New York history tell us about our present experience, or our contemporary experiences of heat waves and other extreme weather?
Unfortunately, it's really relevant, right? I wish this is not what I was hoping for when I started this project 3 years ago, but it's putting front and center the climate crisis that we are watching unfold in North America, and I mean other places around the world as well. It's putting front and center that New York City and lots of urban places do not have climatic design, like kind of climatically sensitive design. There are other parts of the world, Singapore, Dubai, that have really thought about how heat shapes design, and that is not the case in the New York City urban environment that is created in the late 19th century, that really intense grid system. And we're recognizing that the cities we live in, that dense urban cores, have this thing called the urban heat island, which is the phenomenon in summer days of of cities absorbing the radiation from the sun and holding on to that heat and then slowly building up their baseline temperature. And it happens on sunny days that have like low cloud cover in particular. And what it means is that cities absorb all this heat in their concrete and their brick and their pavement. And the larger the building is, the more surface there is. So the urban core of like towers magnifies this. And they slowly let that heat out overnight. And that means it's particularly at night, temperatures don't drop. So even in our suburban or a rural community, temperatures can rise during the day, but soil and trees absorb heat at a lower rate, and then they fast larger differentiation between a summer day and a summer evening in a rural community or a suburban community, something that has a lot of foliage and soil exposed. That's not the case in New York. And so we have built this environmental challenge into our cities, and it's a challenge that isn't faced by all communities at the same level. And so I would argue it's an environmental inequality that is man-made, and that the climate crisis is exacerbating as global temperatures rise and the sea rises, and New York City is having its temperatures, we are changing kind of climactic zones. We're becoming more humid subtropical every year. The plants that can grow in New York are different now. They're more associated with like the magnolias of the American South. And so as human caused climate change changes the environment, it also changes the water temperature of the Atlantic Ocean, which leads to more humidity in the air. And it also changes the amount of rain that is stored in the atmosphere that comes down in our storms. We got over 7 inches of rain in a single storm in September in Hurricane Ida. So this is human impact on climate. And then the urban heat island exacerbates those things. So we have built this into our cities, and different communities suffer more. There's been a lot of conversation lately about tree cover, and Sonia Dumpelman has a wonderful book called Seeing Trees that talks about the role of trees in cities in New York and Berlin. And we're seeing these conversations from Baltimore to Washington, D.C. to New York, that communities that have a higher socioeconomic demographic have more tree coverage, more arboreal coverage. And that means that trees help moderate the urban temperature. They help protect the shade, and then the respiration keeps temperatures cooler. And so not only have we built into cities an urban heat island, we have micro extremes within the cities. And so places like Mott Haven in the South Bronx, which is one of the poorest congressional districts in America, the poorest, has fewer trees and can have a 20-degree differential in Fahrenheit between an Upper West Side, which is leafy, and these neighborhoods that are not. And we're seeing citizen scientist work to track these temperatures, because this is part of urban inequalities, the way that access to public health care and public education and safe spaces and green spaces, now access to cool spaces, is part of our conversation. And it's only going to be more important as temperatures continue to rise, right? And I think it's not just about New York, and I'm a historian of New York City, so this is where my research lies, but New York, like the globe, is seeing rising temperatures, and New York is an example of global urbanization. The UN estimates by 2050, 68% of the global population will live in an urban area. So we need to think about these questions of urban heat, because urban heat is increasingly the summer heat that the global population will be exposed to.
Absolutely. Yeah, all of these points that you bring up are so important and so key, and really do illustrate how this past that you're writing about is still very present, and we can get so much out of reading these stories of the past. And I just want to thank you for writing this piece for us and for sharing it. I know people really liked it. It was popular, and I suggest everyone head over to our website and search Swelter of Summer, and you'll find it, or even just search summer and you'll probably find it. So
yeah, probably. I just think we're getting to build on this we've had like 2.5, 3 decades of great urban environmental history. Yeah. It's for me, some of the most exciting research in our field. I'm biased, but I still would make that claim. And so it gets to build on some great sensory and urban questions that
Mm-hmm.
our peers and our colleagues are asking.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, thank you for joining me today, Kara. This was great.
It was really fun to start the week talking about some history research, though. Thanks for inviting
Awesome.
me.
Have a nice day. Take
You
care.
too.